construction management is the core business. That's what's happening. And property management is what keeps the business moving forward.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right. Well, thank you, Freedom Point podcast listeners, for jumping in here again today. I'm your host, Jeremy Dyer, and today I have with me a friend, a colleague, a mentor, Randy Smith. Randy, thank you for joining us.
Jeremy, super excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. And for my listening audience, Randy Smith is the founder of Impact Equity, which was formed to help investors achieve strong results in their passive real estate investing strategies. Randy and Impact Equity have helped more than 70 investors place over $5 million across 3 operators and 8 different opportunities since launching in just June of 2022. So about a year now. Randy resides with his wife, Jenny, in Peoria, Arizona. And prior to starting Impact Equity, Randy spent 25 years working in various business development opportunities and leadership roles across corporate America. So again, Randy, thanks for jumping in today. I didn't want to steal all your thunder because I know a lot more about you that my audience does not. So can you kind of help us fill in some gaps?
Yeah. So you kind of hit the Reader's Digest version there. Of course, you got the 25 years in corporate America and the recent year or so of working with passive investors. But really, I was a career sales guy. I spent a lot of years carrying the bag, traveling all over the country, meeting with business owners, meeting with clients. Similar background to what you have, and like a lot of us, at some point during that career, I started to get fed up with that 401k investing and what little stock and mutual fund investing I was doing on the side. And I started getting the bug to start investing in real estate. And, my dad had invested in real estate. He bought apartments in LA back in the 80s and 90s. And I was a little afraid to jump into apartments right away. So I went the single family route. And I leveraged a couple of different strategies, one being a turnkey single family strategy, and then another was a BRRRR strategy, all doing this out of state, and found very, very quickly that was not going to scale as quickly or as passively, I guess, that I would have wanted it to scale. So found passive investing through syndication. Haven't looked back since.
Randy, you mentioned turnkey and you mentioned BRRRR strategy. For those of my audience that are not familiar with those terms, could you expand upon that?
Sure. So I can tell you what turnkey is by definition, and then I will tell you what turnkey was in my experience. Very, very different things as it would turn out. So turnkey, by definition, and as it sounds, is this idea that as an investor, you can invest some dollars with an operator, and it's like literally turning the key and you have a passive investment. So the idea is that the operator will go in and probably find an ugly house and renovate it, make it look pretty, fix all the systems, and then put a tenant in it, and then hand it over to their property management team. And by the time it gets to you, you put your money down and then you just start getting the mailbox money. So that's how it was marketed. And that's how I saw a lot of people actually having quite a bit of success. But that was not my experience at all. I ended up working with an operator that, not to talk badly about the operator, but it was anything but turnkey. It turns out he had not done the renovations that he had presented that he had. His property management was not as I guess as skilled as I would have liked them to be. And the tenants that they had in these two properties were, um, well, they're the type of tenants you would expect to live in a property that is not fixed up to the caliber that you and I might expect. So it ended up being anything but turnkey. It cost me a ton of money. I spent a lot of money on repairs in the first, actually throughout the entire hold period. And fortunately, real estate investing is very forgiving. So when I did finally sell these things last year, about 3 or 4 years into it, I still made quite a bit of money on it. But without the market doing what it's done in the last handful of years, I would have definitely been out of pocket after
Yeah, well,
selling
that's great.
those.
I'm glad that your story had a happy ending there.
It
Uh,
did. Yeah, it definitely did.
That's great. Well, you talked about two different transitions. You talked about this transition from being kind of laser focused, I guess, on investing in the public equity market through stocks, and then kind of transitioning over to investing into real estate. So I'd like you to unpack that transition a little bit for my audience of what kind of the mindset took and why did you primarily make that transition in the first place to investing into real estate versus just stocks, bonds, and other commercial grade investment, so to speak. And the
Yep.
second transition that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is that transition from being active in real estate to deciding to instead do it on the passive side?
Yeah. Really, really good questions and big kind of transformational shifts that occur, I think, in most real estate investors' life. Um, so as I kind of alluded to earlier, I I had got to a point in my career where we started creating quite a bit of capital that was just sitting on the sidelines, and I had started maxing out the 401ks and started maxing out um, the employer I was with for the final 10 years of my career. They had some additional high income earner benefits that you could max out as well, and still at that point I had additional dollars that were just essentially sitting in accounts. So I started to spend some more time really investigating that path. I read a really good book by Tony Robbins. It was a book about 3 inches thick, and the summary was invest in. Oh goodness, now I can't even remember the name of them. I'm so far away from the stock market now that I can't even remember what they're called. But basically, invest in index funds. It took like 600 pages to say invest in index funds. Um, and over the years, I had played with different single stocks and not done very well with that. And I just didn't have a lot of confidence in the stock market as a whole. I had seen my dad leave. He had worked for LA County Sheriff's Department for 35 years. And the year he left, the stock market took a huge dip, and he ended up having to go back and get another job after that. So that was kind of playing in the back of my mind. 2008 was playing in the back of my mind. And I had always had this idea that someday when I get established, then I'm going to start investing in real estate. And as the stars would align, that time was about 6 or 7 years ago. So that was kind of that first transition. And I would say that I've always been somewhat of an entrepreneur at heart. Even though I worked in corporate America, I always worked with small business owners, and I was always fascinated with the entrepreneur mindset, the entrepreneur story. So the idea of being able to have a little kind of side business while I'm working my W-2 was really attractive to me, to help basically work on that part of the mind that's not really allowed in corporate America. Okay. So that's the first transition. Second transition, this idea of single family to multifamily, it's really just a scalability um, function. And that combined with the fact of starting to get a good, I got enough calls from the property manager with issues going on. I got enough issues with financing. I had enough issues come up with the whole process of single family investing to realize like this was probably not a world that I want to be involved with full time, because it's brutal. I mean, it is anything but passive. Um, there are people that are, I would say, questionable with integrity at best in that arena, and it was coming from the corporate America world. I was used to dealing with a certain caliber person in corporate America, especially coming from Fortune 100, Fortune 200 companies, to start playing in this world with a different type of person. I'll just say that, not good or bad, just different. And I made the decision I wanted to go to bigger, larger organizations where you have people practicing their expertise and their trades and just really being the best that they can be in those areas. So that's kind of a little bit about that background. We could probably talk for days about that process, but that's kind of a high level.
When you were actively managing single family, do you have any horror stories that you'd like to share, or that you'd
Oh,
be willing to share?
sure. Like I've got a few actually. God, this could be a whole series of podcasts too. So let's see here. I mean, on the turnkey one, uh, like month two, getting an $8,000 bill for a new roof, that's always exciting. Getting the $1,000 to $2,000 bills like month after month after month for this weird plumbing expense that just can't get fixed, but seems to keep producing bills. My wife and I bought a house that eventually would be a tear down. We didn't think it would be a tear down because when we bought it, we had a realtor that was really excited about the opportunity that was presented. But after we bought it and put 100 grand into this and finally got somebody out there who was an expert to say, no, this thing just needs to be torn to the ground. That was a very, very rude awakening. And then, we had an air conditioner stole like the day before a tenant was moving in. We had a contractor like break down and like he was having a nervous breakdown with us. He was crying and he was worried we were like he was letting us down and his wife was going to be so disappointed. It just goes on. We had a bug issue at one house that is just disgusting. Like we threw thousands of dollars after trying to get this bug issue resolved. And not just there's a couple of bugs crawling on the walls, like infestations. So it was if you want to hear crazy stories, talk to people that invest in single family BRRRR strategy stuff for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Passive investing is just boring. I hate to say it.
Well, I've had my fair share of horror stories myself, as some listening might be familiar with the fact that we fixed and flipped houses, for a number of years. So, anything from the bed bugs to the water problems to the foundation issues to the septic systems going out, 1 week before closing, I've got all those same stories as well. So,
Yeah.
very similar to you is when I, kind of got to the point where I was at kind of that breaking point, dealing with, tenants and trash and toilets and termites and all the different complexities that go into, being an active real estate investor, then making that transition, into passive real estate investing. And I know that one of your, missions at Impact Equity is to bring that education and awareness to others, right? And so one question that I have for you then is, how do you as an organization or Impact Equity, how do you make a decision on which particular sponsors or syndication teams to partner with?
Yeah, I think ultimately that is the number one question a passive investor needs to be asking themselves is how do you sort through. I mean, there are literally hundreds of different operators out there with various asset classes and geographies and business strategies. There's so many options to choose from. So you've got to like come up with some type of buy box or investor box that you have and then start going through that process. And I think first and foremost, investors need to know if they are a growth investor or a cash flow investor or some kind of combination of those two. And then once they understand that, start looking for operators that operate with business plans that will produce those type of results. So when I first got started, I didn't know what type of investor I was. I just knew that I got excited when I met with some operators and they seemed like good guys and they had really pretty decks and the numbers seemed to make sense. So that's why I invested with them. As my expertise and kind of my knowledge has grown in that area, it's become much more detailed, but at a very, very high level, always look at track record. Make sure my personal opinion is I only like to work with people that have at least 10 deals under their belt and they've got a handful of full cycle deals under their belt. Now, that will immediately strike out probably 90% of the people you run into, because there are all kinds of groups out there that he and a buddy met at a weekend guru seminar, and they've decided to become syndicators, and they're taking investor capital for their new $20 million deal that they're doing. And I don't have anything against those folks. I just personally don't want to bet my hard-earned dollars or my investor dollars on those type of deals. So first and foremost, have a track record. Secondly, I'm starting to see more and more why it's really important to have my dollars and my investors' dollars placed with operators that have in-house property management and in-house construction management. Because at the end of the day, those are the two main things that differentiate between business plans that succeed and don't succeed. These are, if you're doing value add of any kind, construction management is the core business. That's what's happening. And property management is what keeps the business moving forward. And there's not high profit margins in property management. So if you're using third-party property management, those companies are in place to earn a profit, and they're making a profit on the dollars that should be going back to the investors, in my opinion. So those are two things. I do a lot more with due diligence, but those are kind of the first two that really will decrease the amount of people that are available, or amount of operators that are available to choose from.
Yeah, no, that's great. You bring up some really good points there with the property management company and the building contractor, the general contractor. I would suppose it'd be incredibly disruptive to a sponsor's business plan to have to fire a property management company or a building contractor if they're not meeting, what the agreed upon expectations were on the front end. So I could only imagine, with that being vertically integrated, now that property management company only has a client of one, and it happens to be the sponsor themselves, right?
Right. And a lot of times these property management groups, they are, somebody has a handful of apartments, so they start their own property management crew. And then because they're not making any money, they start bringing on other clients. And if you're a property management company and you've got half of your properties are yours and half are somebody else's, who do you think is going to get the attention when resources get constrained, as they will? You're obviously going to, the average Joe would lean towards his own properties versus somebody else's. So
that's right. That's right. Well, good. Well, there are oftentimes many investors that have listened to this podcast or, future other podcasts that might not be familiar with what would be some questions that the passive investor that's maybe never made a passive investment before in a real estate syndication. What would be a couple of the questions that you would encourage that they ask of the sponsor before they make that decision to wire transfer in their $50,000 investment?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the biggest challenges I think a new investor comes into is like understanding the numbers behind the underwriting that are occurring, that shows up on this investor deck, that always, like the last page in an investor deck always looks pretty, right? The numbers always look perfect. So to expect a new passive investor to know how to come in and actually underwrite that specific deal at the level that they do is really kind of unrealistic to expect that they can do that. But everybody who's looking at a deal can take a look at the assumptions and see if those assumptions make sense. In this market today, does it make sense to think that you can increase rents year over year by 8 or 9%, or even 6 or 5% for that matter, without doing any renovations? It's probably not that easy to do if they're not doing any renovations on those units. So do those numbers make sense? When you're looking at cap rates in the underwriting model, do you see cap rates that are they lower on the exit, or are they larger on the exit? Like, you'll hear everybody say it's conservatively underwritten. And I think that's just something all operators have to say. They're all conservatively underwritten. Well, they're not all conservatively underwritten. That's the reality of it. So if you see where cap rates are actually compressing, That's probably not going to happen in this market. And in all likelihood, at any time, that didn't make sense to have like decreasing cap rates. Um, Expenses. A lot of times you'll see where operators will say, this operator's had the property for 5 years, their expense ratio is X percentage, but we're so good that we're going to decrease that expense ratio in year one. And I've seen a lot of different operators that say, we're going to come in, and because we're such a fantastic operator, we're going to decrease expenses. In reality, it very, very, very rarely happens that that expense ratio is going to drop. One, insurance and interest rates and taxes are always going up. So to assume that that number is going to come down, it's just not. It's not. It doesn't make sense to consider that. So I think digging into the assumptions is a really good place for a new passive investor to start looking, because generally those assumptions are placed on a deck somewhere and they're very easily identified. And if when you talk to the folks, they can't talk to their assumptions with confidence, then that's probably your first red flag. And then when you give a gut check to them, if you're a little concerned, then that concern is probably valid as well.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. You mentioned, challenging the rent growth assumptions, which makes, total sense. You
Yeah.
can see what the sponsor, projects those rents to be after the reposition efforts, and utilize that in order to kind of compare against the competitive assets in that
Yep.
same market, right?
Yep.
For a similar product. You talked about expenses, obviously with inflation being what it has been, the last, several years, right? And more than likely to continue on into the future. I could only expect that, expenses, need to be, a big part of that pro forma and that sponsor's ability, to produce the return, projections that they projected in their deal deck, right?
Mhm.
But you mentioned this concept of cap rates, and I'm relatively confident that many people know what a cap rate is, but can you explain how a cap rate is calculated, and specifically why that expected exit cap rate in terms of when that deal goes full cycle, why that's incredibly important to the investor returns?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there is a indirect correlation or indirect relationship between cap rate and the essentially the sales price of the assets or the value of the assets. So as cap rates go down, the value of the assets go up. There's also a relation between interest rates, where as interest rates go up, cap rates tend to go up as well. And we're obviously in a raising interest rate environment today. So essentially, cap rate is calculated by the net operating income, which is all of the income. So it's income less expenses, excluding the debt service. So the net operating income divided by the cap rate equals the value of the asset. And you can move those three around in any way. So the value of the asset divided by the cap rate gives you the NOI, I believe, those different areas. So now it's important to note that um, the value of assets or the cap rate itself is actually generally market specific. So if you're looking at Class B garden style apartments in Arizona, today you might be at call it a 5.5% cap rate. And that's just essentially the rate that the market is willing to pay at that given time for that type of asset. So it's important when people start categorizing classes as well. And I see this a lot where people will call it a B plus asset. And when you go and you walk that property, like I consider a B plus something that I might have lived in college, right? Maybe a B I would have lived in college is kind of my frame of reference. And if I walk there and the hair on the back of my neck stands up and I'm a little concerned because the sun's setting, we're probably B minus C plus, I'm guessing. So cap rates are tied to asset or to the class as well. So just be careful because that's another thing that can be manipulated in space. So
Yeah,
did I
absolutely.
answer all the questions?
You did a great job. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Randy. What are
Okay.
some assets that you're generally investing yourself into? I know that you mentioned multifamily, but are there any other asset classes that you look to bring those opportunities to your investor base?
Yeah, so I am primarily a multifamily investor first, and essentially the opportunities that I bring to my investors mirror my portfolio as well. So, majority of the deals that I'm going to put in front of my investors are going to be value add multifamily, specifically in Arizona and Texas. Those are the two areas where I invest most heavily, and those are the deals I put in front of my investors. Um, I have this other, that's probably 80% of my portfolio. 20% of my portfolio is a bunch of different asset classes. I've got short-term rentals, which is a really fun one that I've been playing around with for the last, oh, call it year and a half or so. I'm in self-storage. I just started doing these, not the pretty car washes, but the like the 4 or 5 bay car washes with one touchless on one side. And the wash your own car type of place, essentially. Um, I really like industrial. I'm in this ATM fund, which is just a cash flow cow, and mobile home parks. So, I reserve that 20% to kind of, and I say play with in air quotes, but those are tend to be a little more risky, and not as tried and true. I don't believe as the multifamily is. So I use those dollars to really vet other operators, vet other deals for other alternative investments to bring not only to my portfolio but to my investors as well.
Well, that sounds good. It sounds to me like you're, not just walking the walk, talking the talk, etc. When it
Mhm.
comes to your own investment strategy, and also encouraging others, to do the same, when it comes to having a well diversified, portfolio within real estate. I oftentimes get the question from investors that want to help their young adolescent children or young professional children to have a proper investing mindset. So my
Mhm.
question for you, Randy, is if you could go back and give your 18-year-old self one
Mhm.
piece of investing advice, what would that be?
I mean, the short answer is invest more sooner, right? That would be it. Um, and when I think kind of the advice that I give to younger investors today, it is that like get some dollars into this space sooner. But I really like the idea of house hacking. And I started out house hacking when I was in college. I stopped at that point, but I think house hacking, whether it be renting a house and renting out to your buddy, or buying a house and renting out to your buddies or whoever, or doing the duplex, triplex, quad, before you have a wife and kids that aren't willing to do that. I think that can make a lot of sense, and it might be counter to this idea of passive investing, but I think it makes a lot of sense to get your hands dirty and and deal with renters and deal with renovations and deal with all the issues that you'll deal with as a landlord, because that's going to pay off for the rest of your investing career. So invest early and often, and then also try to get your hands dirty along the way a little bit.
Yeah, great advice, Randy. Randy, what does financial freedom mean to you?
Yeah, so financial freedom, for me, it is having all or the majority of my monthly expenses covered by passive income, to where I get to choose what it is that I do with my time. Because I think financial freedom um, ties to time freedom more than anything. And as a guy who did have some financial struggles earlier in my life, the burden of carrying around debt and carrying around bad debt on your shoulders can wear you down to a point where you're essentially working to make money to pay the debt versus working to make money to curate and create the life that you want to live. And if people give me a hard time about this, but my wife and I actually leveraged Dave Ramsey's baby step process to get out from under some of these other challenges that we had. And it's a little counter to wealth generation, but it is a really, really good way to kind of get control of your finances. And then maybe Dave Ramsey 2.0 would be what you and I are doing today passively.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm glad that you highlighted the fact that It's not always about financial freedom. It's more about time freedom. It's the one thing
Yep,
that we can't create more of, and that is
exactly.
time. We can always create more finances, right? Working a little bit harder, spending a little bit extra time in the evenings and the weekends with a side hustle or our current W-2 jobs. But time is one thing that is limited for everyone. Okay. And
Yep,
and that's one of the main genesis behind why I invest, passively into real estate myself, is because I'm really looking for a way, someday where I've got that time freedom, where maybe work becomes optional, right?
yep,
Maybe not necessarily looking to completely escape, the dependence on the W-2, but certainly be in
yep.
a position in my life where I can make those, decisions so that somebody else isn't making them for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when your real estate investing is created income that covers your monthly expenses, all of a sudden you have options that you never knew you had. And as you know, that's part of my story. When I got laid off in May of last year, um, most of my expenses were covered by my passive income. So it was very, very different than 10 years prior when I got laid off and I had not been real estate investing. So real estate investing and specifically passive investing can create a freedom that I think everybody should experience, because once you have that freedom, you can go out and do whatever it is you want to do. And odds are you're going to be more passionate, more productive, and better at what you're doing because you're not having to go into the job, you're getting to go into the job.
Yeah, that's
So
right. Absolutely. Randy, are you ready to get straight to the point?
I'm ready.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, Kay, in quick succession, and I want quick answers, not long ones, Kay?
Okay. Okay.
You ready to go?
Let's do it.
All right. If you had $1 million in cash on the sidelines, where would you put it?
I would put it in, let's see here, 10 different syndications at 100 grand a piece.
What is one or two ways that you use to give your talents back?
My Calendly is available to anybody and everybody who wants to connect with me and learn from any of my past experience.
What is a favorite book and or podcast that you'd like to share with the audience?
Book is Gap in the Game by Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan. And then a podcast that I really like is the Old Castle podcast. Really good podcast about the state of the multifamily market.
That's great. I haven't heard of that one, but I'll go check that out.
Yep.
What is the next item on your bucket list that you'd like to check off?
Next item on the bucket list is an African safari at this point.
Do you have a date scheduled?
I do not yet, but I did step foot on the continent of Africa last year, because the goal is to hit all 7 continents. So coming soon, definitely.
All right, sounds good. Last question is, how can our audience connect with you to hear more about what you're up to?
Yeah, impactequity.net is my website. I spend most of my time on LinkedIn. So either place has a way to connect with me. I've got a free giveaway on my website, which is essentially a summary of passive investing how-tos. And you can get that by going to impactequity.net.
Great. Randy, thank you so much for joining the real estate podcast today, Freedom Point. Appreciate you as always, and look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.